All right, let's dive in. Today we're heading to 19th century Ethiopia.
Sounds exciting.
It is. We're going to untangle the life of this guy, Ras Alula Njida.
Oh, I've heard the name.
Yeah, he's a pretty big deal in Ethiopian history. We've got a Wikipedia article about him
Okay.
and a piece from a website called Azantawi.
Interesting.
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to figure out what made this guy tick,
Okay.
what were his big wins,
hmm
and how should we view him today? All this complexity.
Right, right. Well, one of the most fascinating things about Ras Alula, and you can see this in both of the sources, is how he started.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he was just a farmer's son,
Wow.
and he ends up becoming one of the most powerful military leaders in Ethiopia.
That's quite the jump.
It is.
Yeah.
To really understand that trajectory, you have to understand the context of what was going on in Ethiopia during his time.
So set the scene for us. What was happening that allowed someone like Alula to, rise to the top?
Well, think about it. Ethiopia in the 19th century, they're getting pressure from, all sides.
Oh, yeah.
You've got the Egyptians expanding their territory. You've got this new modest movement gaining power in Sudan.
Oh, right.
And, of course, you can't forget about Europe. Those colonial powers were always lurking.
Always hungry for more land.
Exactly. So it was a really unstable time for Ethiopia. And in times like that, strong military leaders, they become really, really important. That's where Alula comes in.
I think it's interesting that the Wikipedia article mentions his childhood nickname was actually Ras Alula.
Oh, wow.
Even though Ras is a really high noble title, it's like comparing him to a duke.
So people already saw his potential from a young age. That's pretty incredible. It speaks volumes about his, charisma, that natural leadership quality that he probably had even as a kid. But we also can't forget he was a pretty smart political player, too.
Really? How so?
Well, for example, his second marriage. He married Voziro Amlesu Araya, who was the daughter of Ras Araya Dimsu, a super influential figure. That was definitely a strategic move on Alula's part.
It's all about who you know, right?
Right. It helped him solidify his position and gain more influence.
So it wasn't just about being a good military commander. He understood court politics, too. He knew how to play the game.
Exactly. He had to. Remember, this is a time when power dynamics were constantly shifting. Alliances were made and broken all the time. And strategic marriages. They were a big part of that whole power struggle.
So we've got this ambitious guy. Alula's clearly skilled in battle, savvy in politics. Seems like the perfect recipe for him to leave his mark on history, right?
Absolutely. And his rise to prominence, it really kicks off during the Egyptian-Ethiopian War. The Wikipedia article, it talks about these two big battles he was in.
Oh, yeah.
Gundit and Gouda.
Battles. Everyone loves a good battle story.
Well, these battles were huge for Alula and for Ethiopia.
In what way?
Well, at the time, Alula was a Shaleka, which wasn't as high up on the military ladder. But he was brilliant during those battles. He really showed his strategic skills.
Nice.
And because of that, he earned Emperor Johannes V's respect,
I bet.
which eventually paved the way for him to be promoted to Ras. It's a big deal.
That promotion comes with a pretty big job, too, right?
You're talking about his appointment as governor.
Yeah, the Azantawi source mentions it. He
Yep.
becomes the governor of Mareb Melash.
A really important region. Part of Eritrea today.
So this is 1876. Sounds like a pretty important moment for him.
It was. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, though.
Oh, why not?
Well, this appointment, it was actually to try and squash a rebellion that was happening,
Oh, wow.
led by a guy named Ras Alula.
Huh, okay.
And get this, Alula was the first person from south of the Mareb River to be appointed governor of this area.
So he was kind of an outsider.
You could say that. And being the new guy in charge, Alula, well, he ruled with an iron fist. Lots of strict policies and military campaigns to show everyone who was boss.
I can imagine that didn't make him very popular.
It definitely created some tension with the people living there.
So here he is, climbing the ranks, proving himself as a military leader. But it sounds like he's already stirring up some controversy.
Yeah, that tension between his military achievements and his, let's say, forceful methods, that becomes a bit of a theme in his story.
Interesting. But before we go down that road, there's another threat brewing, right? Remember the Mahdists we talked about earlier?
Oh, right, the Mahdist War. They were a serious challenge to Ethiopia's western borders.
And a seasoned commander like Ras Alula, I'm guessing he wouldn't just sit this one out.
You guessed right. Alula found himself right back on the front lines.
And this is where the Battle of Kufit comes in, am I right? The one in 1885.
You got it. It was a brutal battle. Alula's forces against the Mahdist army led by Osman Digna.
I've read a bit about the Mahdists. They were a formidable force.
They were, and this battle, it was a victory for Alula, but it was a really costly one. Heavy casualties on both sides. Even Alula himself was wounded.
Wow. All this fighting, it really shows just how volatile things were in Ethiopia at that time. It seems like they were always on the defensive.
You're not wrong. It was a time of almost constant warfare. And as we'll see, things were about to get even more complicated with a new player entering the scene.
What are we talking about now?
Italy.
Ah, yes, Italy. Those ambitious Europeans with their colonial dreams. I have a feeling this is going to make things a whole lot messier.
It most certainly does.
So we're back, and things are heating up with Italy entering the picture. Those colonial ambitions, they're like adding fuel to the fire,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. It's a major turning point, not just for Ras Alula, but for Ethiopia as a whole. You have to remember, the late 19th century, that was prime time for European colonialism.
Scramble for Africa and all that.
Exactly. Italy, they were late to the game, and they were determined to carve out their own piece of the pie. And they saw an opportunity in the Horn of Africa.
And the Hewitt Treaty of 1884, that plays a role in all of this, right? I remember reading in the Wikipedia article that treaty was supposed to, like, solidify Ethiopia's claim to the Bogos and Massawa regions.
Right. The Hewitt Treaty was a big diplomatic win for Emperor Johannes V. It basically acknowledged Ethiopia's sovereignty over those areas. But, agreements on paper don't always mean much in reality.
Because Italy just decided to ignore it.
Pretty much. They started pushing into Ethiopian territory, completely disregarding the Hewitt Treaty. It was a direct challenge to Ras Alula, who was in charge of defending that region.
I can see how that would make him angry.
Oh, it was a huge insult. Not just to him personally, but to the entire Ethiopian empire.
And then we get the Battle of Dogali in 1887. That one really made Alula's reputation as this fierce defender of Ethiopia. The Wikipedia article calls it a decisive victory for his forces against the Italians. But was there anything about this battle, any tactics or anything that really stood out to you?
What's interesting about Dogali, and the sources don't explicitly say this, but Alula, he understood the terrain. And he used it brilliantly.
Oh, how?
He picked the battleground carefully, forcing the Italians into this narrow valley. They were totally exposed, perfect for ambushes and flanking maneuvers.
Smart.
And that tactic, using the land to his advantage, he did that a lot. It shows he was thinking beyond just brute force. He was a real strategist.
It makes you wonder what might have happened if he'd had, like, modern military training and resources.
Oh, for sure. He could have been unstoppable. But even with this win at Dogali, Italy doesn't back down, right?
No, they don't. They end up establishing the colony of Eritrea, which, well, that sets the stage for even more conflict later on.
Yep. Dogali was a blow to Italy, but it didn't stop him. And that colony of Eritrea, that became a constant source of tension between the two countries.
And then things get even more complicated when Emperor Johannes V dies in 1889.
Right. A huge power vacuum.
The Wikipedia article mentions that Johannes wanted his son, Ras Mengesha, to take over. But that didn't really go as planned, did it?
Not quite. Menelik II, he was ruling Shewa at the time, saw his chance and declared himself emperor.
Oh, wow. So this puts Ras Alula in a tough spot.
You bet. Alula was known for his loyalty to Johannes, and now he's got this new emperor to deal with. A whole new set of challenges.
So what does he do? Does he, like, challenge Menelik's claim? Start a fight?
There's a bit of mystery surrounding that period. Alula was kind of isolated up in Mareb Milash. And the Italian presence in Eritrea, well, that had weakened his position. I bet. Challenging Menelik directly. That was a risky move. Remember, the Asantawi source says Alula had never really solidified his control over Mareb Milash, even though he tried.
So maybe aligning with Menelik was his best move.
Could be. A way to stay in the game. Maybe even regain some of his lost influence. Remember, this is a guy who knows how to play the game of power.
That's a good point. It wasn't just about being loyal. It was about survival, too. So he throws his support behind Menelik, but I doubt that solves the whole Italian problem, does it?
Nope. Menelik had this growing threat from Italy to deal with. And that's when we get the Treaty of Wuchel in 1889.
That treaty, that's the one that actually gives Italy control over Eritrea, right? How is that supposed to be a peaceful solution?
It's a great example of how diplomacy can go wrong. How language mistranslations can have huge consequences. See, the Amharic and Italian versions of that treaty, they had some subtle but really important differences in how they talked about Ethiopia's foreign relations.
Oh, so they basically tricked Menelik.
Pretty much. The Italian version implied that Ethiopia was now a protectorate of Italy, which took away a lot of their independence. And when Menelik figured that out, oh, he was furious.
I bet.
He denounced the treaty, a really bold move considering how strong the Italian military was.
So that sets us up for the big showdown, right? The Battle of Adwa, the one where Ethiopia defeats a European power.
One of the most significant battles in African history, a real symbol of resistance against colonialism.
And Alula plays a key role in this battle, right? The Wikipedia article mentions that he was strategically positioned to block Italian reinforcements. But what about his specific contributions? What made him so valuable to Menelik's forces?
Alula's experience and knowledge of the terrain, that was priceless. Augustus Wilde, this British explorer who knew Alula, he called him the Garibaldi of Ethiopia, comparing him to that famous Italian general. Shows you how much respect Alula commanded. He knew how to use the landscape to his advantage, and his understanding of Italian tactics from their previous encounters. That was crucial in anticipating their moves.
It's amazing to think about. This farmer's son, who started out pretty low on the military ladder, he becomes a key player in one of Ethiopia's greatest victories. But this is the deep dive, so I'm guessing there's still more to the story.
Oh, definitely. Adwa was a huge moment, but it wasn't the end for Alula. And as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, even for national heroes, the path isn't always smooth.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive on Ras Alula and Jida. We've seen his journey, from those humble beginnings to being a major player in defending Ethiopia against, well, everyone, it seems. Egyptians, Mahdists, even the Italians. What a story.
It really is. And you'd think after that incredible win at Adwa, a guy like Ras Alula, he just, ride off into the sunset. Everyone would see him as this legendary hero. But history rarely works out that neatly, does it?
I guess not. So what happens?
Well, remember earlier we were talking about how Alula faced some pushback when he was ruling Mayor of Melash?
Yeah, the Azantawi source mentioned those strict policies. It seemed like the locals weren't too happy about it.
Exactly. And that wasn't the only time his methods caused some friction.
So there's more to this hero image.
There were always layers, right? His military skills, they were undeniable. But the way he went about things, it was often seen as harsh, even for those times. And remember, we're talking about a period when warfare was brutal. The line between, keeping order and using too much force, it could get blurry.
That makes sense. It's like trying to judge someone from the past by today's standards. It's tricky. So how do we even begin to reconcile those contrasting parts of Alula's legacy?
It's a question historians are still wrestling with. I think the key is to acknowledge everything, the good and the bad. Alula was a product of his environment, a time of constant conflict. We have to look at his actions through the lens of that historical context, not just with our modern-day values and judgments.
It's almost like we're piecing together this puzzle, but some of the pieces don't quite fit. On one hand, we have this national hero, this incredible military mind, but then there's evidence of those harsh tactics and the resentment he caused. It's a bit of a contradiction.
That's what makes studying history so fascinating. It's not about finding simple answers or labeling people as good or bad. It's about embracing that complexity. Trying to understand the nuances of these historical figures and the world they lived in.
So, even after all this digging, we still don't have a clear-cut answer to who Ras Alula really was.
And I think that's okay. The point isn't to put him in a box, label him as a hero or a villain. It's about recognizing him as a complex person who had a huge impact on Ethiopia's history. Someone who deserves to be remembered for his strategic brilliance, his dedication to defending his nation, but also for the controversies that came along with his methods.
I get that. But then why should we care about Ras Alula and Jida today, over 100 years later? What does his story have to do with us in the 21st century?
I think there have been important lessons we can learn. For one, Alula's life shows the power of ambition and determination. He went from the bottom of the ladder to achieving incredible things. It reminds us that even when things seem impossible, one person can make a real difference.
His story also shows us that leadership, it often comes with a price. Making tough choices, especially in times of war, can have ripple effects you don't always see coming.
Exactly. And maybe the most important lesson is that we should always be critical of how we look at history. Question the stories we're told, dig a little deeper, and remember that even those we celebrate as heroes, they're not perfect.
It seems like the more we learn, the more questions we have.
Isn't that great? The more we explore, the more we realize how much more there is to discover. It's a never-ending journey.
I'm definitely feeling inspired to keep learning. I'm already thinking about what books and articles I can read next to delve deeper into Ras Alula, the battles he fought, and that whole era.
I encourage you to do that. And for our listeners who are feeling the same way, don't worry, we'll include some extra resources in the show notes.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive. We've uncovered military genius, political maneuvering, and the complexities of a historical figure who defied simple labels. I hope you've enjoyed listening as much as we've enjoyed exploring this together. And until next time, keep diving deep.